Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. I love my job because I get to interview experts on subjects that I really don't know much about, but I'm just fascinated with. And recently, if you've been listening, we just broke 100 episodes, and there are a few who are experts in the Chinese economy and Chinese history, not so much when it comes to Japan. And so that is why our guest is on today. His name is William Farris, and he has studied this stuff extensively. And he wrote a book called Japan to 1600, A Social and Economic History. Now, before we even get started, I think we're going to get into names like, I believe, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who's the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan for over 250 years during the Edo period. And then another
Edo.
individual, is it Edo?
Yes, Edo.
Edo. And then also I'm thinking one that opened up the Japanese economy to United States economy, and that's Commodore Matthew Perry. So maybe we'll get into that, maybe not, but it is an honor to have you here, sir, William Farris.
All righty.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of the book. It seems like you are in this world, you study it all the time. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because, first of all, Japanese history before 1600 is not that well studied, particularly in English. And there was no one really good textbook for it that summarized. There have been a lot of recent findings in Japan up to 1600. And so I wrote this as kind of a textbook to be used in classrooms. It's also good for the general reader who just wants to know about Japan up until 1600. And so that's really why I wrote it.
Well, I'm just looking at some of the big names, and I just did a quick little research on Google and try to find some big names that are relevant to Japan prior to 1600. And we're going back to Emperor Jimmu, I think, 711 to 585 BC, the first emperor of Japan. So I don't know if you go back that far, but I just love this type of these type of people in the background that school doesn't really talk about, right? And that seems like your bread and butter.
Well, first of all, Emperor Jimmu never existed. Uh,
Really?
it's a complete myth. No, when he's only mentioned in histories that were compiled about uh, about 700, and in those histories that were compiled in 700, the Japanese were interested in backdating the origins of their dynasty as far as possible. So they backdated it to someone called Jimmu. Jimmu literally means divine warrior, and they backdated it to him. He's supposed to have ascended the throne in 660 BCE, but he never existed. And in fact, the first uh, several first 10 so-called emperors that are listed in the annals in the histories are all made up.
Amazing. And that's why you just never know. You don't know what's written down. You don't know what to believe. Uh, and that's why it's really tough to kind of like make decisions about history so long ago. So it's basically a fictional character.
Yeah, Jimmu is completely fictional. He was probably made up of several different composite figures. He might have been modeled on the first real emperor of Japan is named Timmu, the heavenly warrior emperor, and he was on the throne from 672 until 686, and he is the one who really started the dynasty. And so when they had to find a founding figure for it, they backdated it as far as they possibly could, and they modeled it much after Timmu. Both of them were known for their abilities to fight wars.
Wow. Okay. So when it comes to Asia, very much like Sun Tzu with the Chinese warrior mentality and Confucius, right? The Stoic approach to things. Is he sort of like the first figurehead of embracing the warrior mentality? Is that what you're saying?
Well, he has nothing to do with the samurai, if that's what you mean. He's not the word for warrior in Japanese is samurai. It means one who attends or one who serves, and samurai didn't really become clearly present in Japanese history until after 900. So long after Tim had died, but he was, but Japan at the time was, at the time of Timmu, was fearing an attack from the Chinese. And so Timmu did lay an emphasis on military affairs.
Mm. Well, I know whenever you get closer to what the 1700s, 1800s, that's whenever we start to like understand a little bit more about Japanese culture. But what was like the major shift? Was there anything that really happened prior to 1600 that is extremely shocking that most of my audience would have no clue ever existed?
Let's see, what kind of major shifts? Well, one of them, the kind of history I'm interested in is social and economic history, which deals with such things as the economy and population and less political history. But one of the major shifts was the retreat of epidemic disease. And there were terrible epidemics in Japan around the time of Timmu. And these epidemics caused the population to remain stable for a very long time. Japan did not grow, and it didn't really. The change didn't really come until around 1300.
Okay. 1300. All right. And so can you go into a little bit more detail about exactly what was going on there?
Well, in 1300, not long after 1300, there was a great civil war in Japan, and the civil war resulted in the foundation of the Muromachi shogunate, the Muromachi warrior government in 1333, and this was a direct precursor to the Tokugawa, which you talked about, and the Muromachi had a vibrant economy. They had money that they used. They gave loans to peasants. They were quite powerful, particularly under the third shogun Yoshimitsu, who ruled around 1400. Japan was sending embassy to China and trading with Okinawa and with Korea and with China. And in general, the period from 1300 to 1600 links up very well with the Tokugawa period.
Economically, they had a certain export from what I gathered. I think it has to do with silk. Is that right? Japan was known for a certain type of export for many, many generations. Is that right?
Not really. Japanese silk was of inferior grade all the way up until the 1800s, and
Got
then
it.
the Japanese learned to make better silk, and eventually their silk was better than the Chinese, and so that's why they're known for their silk. But it didn't really occur until the 1800s.
Wow. Okay. So prior to 1600, I guess the major were they battling with Korea more than any? Who was their biggest? I guess you could say enemy or competitor, or
Well, they were invaded twice by the Mongols. They were invaded by the Mongols in 1274 and 1281.
was that with uh who is the main guy? Genghis, right? Genghis Khan.
Well, it was actually with Kublai Khan. What was it? Maybe his grandson. Kublai Khan was the one who invaded Japan, and he invaded both times, but both attempts at invasion were failures.
Wow. So they had a massive army then, Japan at that time.
Well, not really. The army that met the Mongol army was probably measured in tens of thousands, if not more. The Japanese army was only about 5,000. And the first time the Mongols invaded in 1274, we don't know exactly what happened, but for whatever reason, they did not engage the Japanese and they withdrew. Then they invaded again in 1281, and in 1281, when they invaded, they the Mongols were doing pretty well. They were conquering territory in Japan, and then a great typhoon hit their fleet and destroyed their fleet, and that's the origin of the phrase kamikaze, the divine wind.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's the origin of kamikaze.
That's right.
Wow, which obviously became very popular in World War II days. But and
That's right.
so
Yeah.
and was it the same philosophy where it was go to die?
Well, the kamikaze winds were it was a typhoon, and it was more an accident of nature than anything else that destroyed the Mongol fleet in 1281. But later in World War II, the Japanese military, which was losing very badly at the time, decided to have their pilots crash into American ships, and of course the Japanese pilot would be killed. But those, to spur them on to do this great feat of self-sacrifice, the Japanese military called them kamikaze, or the divine wind. They caused a fair amount of damage on Japanese ships, but mostly it resulted in the deaths of Japanese pilots.
Yeah, interesting. What is it about the Japanese culture that fascinates you the most? It seems like you really you love studying it simply because you are fascinated, or you do love the culture. Maybe you respect it in a way that you don't see a lot of the United States or the Western cultures. Maybe adopt certain principles like they do. So, what is it about Japan that really you know makes you fall in love with the culture?
I first went to Japan in December of 1971, and I stayed for about a year and 2 months. And I've lived in Japan a total of 6 years. And Japan is just such a great country to live in. As one of my professors said to me, Japan is a country that you always want to go back to.
Hmm.
And so it's just that the food is good, the people are kind. If you don't speak any Japanese, I speak Japanese, of course, but if you don't speak any Japanese and you go to a subway stop and you're looking for a subway stop and you're kind of peering at the guide maps and you don't know what to do, more than likely a Japanese will come up to you and try his English on you and try to help you get the right directions to where you're going. So they're kind, their food is good, the train system is excellent, they're orderly, just they're clean people. There's not much that you not to like about Japan.
And from what I gather, they're very respectful people, right? They really in society they're very respectful to each other and to outsiders coming
Yes,
in.
that's right. Yes, that's another thing. Very much respect outsiders, and sometimes they don't always understand outsiders, but they're respectful and they're dignified. And these are all generalizations, of course, and you can find exceptions. But for all this reason, they are people that it's just really easy to be around. If I had the chance, I would go back to Japan in a minute. It's a little bit cold right now to go there, though.
Hmm. And I know this is outside the scope of your book, but I'm assuming you still understand. Commodore Matthew Perry, key figure in Japan's modern history, he played a role in opening Japan to the West during the Edo period. Anything you could say about that? Because is he the man that really bridged the gap between U.S. and Japan?
Well, he didn't bridge a gap between the United States and Japan. Um, Perry was ordered by the United States president at the time to go to Japan. There were, first of all, increasingly, Japan was being beset by ships from Russia and the Netherlands and Great Britain and the United States. And all of these countries were doing whaling in the area. And so an American ship would crash or a British ship would crash, and then the Japanese would would not help them, would not do anything for them, and sometimes they were even sort of held as prisoners for a while. So Perry went to open relations with Japan, and he took with him a man who was very important. His name was Townsend Harris. And Townsend Harris negotiated treaties with Japan to open Japan to American trade and to American diplomacy. And that would be in 1867, really all the period of the 1860s and 1870s were opening of Japan to the outside world.
Got it. Now, I'm very familiar with, and I just had a guest on prior to you. It talks about how China is a manufacturing plant, but there are still many companies that we deal with that just outsource to China to do the manufacturing. How the money still goes to China, Japan. Once again, this might be outside of the scope of the book, but Japan is still a major powerhouse when it comes to maybe businesses and certain
Mm-hmm.
companies when it comes to vehicles, right? Dirt bikes, motorcycles, cars. So they really became known for the go-to source maybe in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was a movie called Gung Ho. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Oh,
It
yes.
really did show the contrast between how Americans think and work compared to the Japanese. And they became known as the no nonsense, get it done, do it better than ever. And that became their identity. So I would assume that maybe that started either way before or that's still in them to this day.
Well, Japan's economy was already doing well when Commodore Perry came. It was already beginning to industrialize, and they had good merchant associations and so on. But when Commodore Perry came, Japan adopted a kind of state directed capitalism. And the
Mm,
state directed capitalism caused the Japanese economy to grow really quickly in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And then, of course, World War II happened. World War II was a terrible disaster for Japan. It absolutely ruined Japan. But after World War II, the Japanese, for a variety of reasons, uh, free technology, uh, a willing labor force, uh, currency to invest, things of this sort, became really an economic powerhouse until it became the second largest economy in the world around 2000. And now, of course, it's the third largest economy in the world
behind China.
behind the United States and China.
Interesting. So it's the third. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Um, Go back to before 1600. Any fascinating wars or stories that stand out? I just love major figureheads and maybe some things that they did to overcome the opposition. I love stories like 300 and true stories that show few versus many or individuals who really stood up to corruption.
Uh, well, there was someone who stood up against corruption who was named Sugawara no Michizane. And he lived around 900, and he actually was a good Confucian scholar,
Hmm.
but he ran afoul of a family called the Fujiwara, and the Fujiwara caused him to be banished, and he lost power and he died sort of, but he became a symbol of the loyal and the competent minister.
Wow. And so what year was that you said? 1200?
That was 900.
900. Wow. And you touched on samurai. I want to make sure we get into this. Samurai, you said it happened later than I thought it was. That term, that phrase, that mentality. Can you give us a little bit of the origin on that?
The origins of the samurai, uh, it depends. If you're talking just, first of all, you have to define what a samurai is. And a samurai is a lightly armored, uh, sword swinging, uh, bow and arrow shooting horse rider. So they're actually mounted archers.
Oh, I did. Okay.
Okay,
Different than I
and
thought.
Japan always had mounted archers from about 500 on, but they didn't really become part of the story of the samurai. Really, you can trace the origins back fairly far, but the use of the term samurai is more and more frequent after 900. And then you have mounted archers, these mounted archers, the samurai, the mounted archers, who square off with each other. They fight one on one, sort of like a knight. They fight 1-to-1, and they try to get their opponent in a certain position where they can shoot the arrow into him. And so the samurai do that, and there were samurai wars. There were wars involving the court used the samurai for a long time as their police force, and then eventually the samurai got tired of not having any political power, not having any not having much economic power, and so in 1180 they started a war, and it ended up in 1185 and founded the first Japanese shogunate or Japanese military government.
Wow. So they were the police officers of their time, and then they stood up for themselves, and then they became what? The military.
That's right. Well, they always were the military. They would be used in wars, and the court used them in wars, but they would use them as wars, and then they would give them prizes.
Oh, that's
And, and,
interesting.
and eventually, the samurai got tired of just receiving prizes, and a very famous samurai named Minamoto no Yoritomo decided that he wanted to establish his own government for the samurai, and the court ceded to the samurai the rights to collect taxes and the rights to defend the country. And the new headquarters was found in Kamakura, which is a city that's about 30 or 40 miles away from Tokyo by train.
Hmm.
You can go there today.
Well, this book is really about the social and economic history. What can we learn from Japanese social and economic history? Is there anything you're seeing repeat itself either in a positive or a negative way?
Well, as I said, in a negative way, the epidemics. Epidemics, disease came into Japan from outside, from the continent, and it came into Japan and it would kill off a large number of people who did not have any immunities. And then it would, like COVID, it would eventually burn itself out and not be that bad anymore. But then the disease would disappear, and the next generation grew up and it didn't have any immunities either, and the disease would come back in again and once again afflict the people. This caused the population in Japan to stabilize, so that between about 750 and about 1300, the population of Japan hovered around anywhere from 5 to 6 million, but it never grew. And it was partly because of the epidemics. It was partly because of the famines. There were also some very large famines in Japan, particularly in the 1200s, that killed a lot of people. So all those things happened. But in terms of lessons, really, Japan begins to get organized economically after 1300. And then you see the origins, and in the Tokugawa period, which is 1600 to 1868, the economy really did well. The economy did quite well. And the amount of land under cultivation and the population grew for a while. And by 1600, the population that was 6 million in 1300 was 18 million. So it tripled. And this was because of better grains, better food, more consistent food, better environment, less harsh weather, and advances in medicine. and a variety of things that helped lead Japan to the point where you get to the origins of the pre-modern Japanese economic takeoff is around 1300, maybe a little bit later than that.
But going back to the origin of the samurai, that might be the reason why the culture is built around a martial art, right? It seems like people, whenever I interview them, if they come from Japan or from China, martial arts is just a part of their background. I think that should be a part of anybody in the United States background too. So, is there a reason for that? Were you able to kind of retrace the steps and how that became part of their DNA and how self defense and maybe it does apply to the Stoic approach where control your body, control your thoughts, you can control your life. Anything you can really relate to our audience?
Well, I don't think that you can say that. I would imagine many Japanese do the martial arts, but not most. And I think that there is some influence of the samurai ethic on the character of the Japanese, and that's where the respect for others comes in. That's where other things come in as well. But the Japanese are really not all about fighting. Right now, they have a peace constitution, and they're threatened by China and North Korea, and the Japanese are quite frightened of that.
Wow. Okay, so there is definitely there's a bad blood between China and Japan at this stage.
At what stage?
As of right now, is that what you're saying?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Right now, uh, it's interesting, but I went back to Japan in 2019. And the area I went to was the area around Tokyo University, and now it's all taken over by Chinese restaurants. And the Chinese immigrants have moved to Japan, and the Japanese are fearful of the Chinese because the Chinese, of course, want to take back Taiwan, and they also want much more influence in the world. And it's sort of like the old phrase that was used of France and Europe: when China sneezes, Japan catches a cold.
Wow. It's a good way to put it. Now you have multiple books here. I think there's at least five. Is that right? You have, I think, at least five books written on this same subject.
Seven.
Seven. And one of the ones that really caught my attention was Sacred Texts and Buried Treasures.
Okay,
So if you can kind of, this is 1998 you wrote this one, huh?
that's right.
And so can you relay anything from this? I saw that title and I'm like, oh, that's something I got to bring up. Sacred Texts and Buried Treasures. What is this one referring?
It refers to what it is. It's a book that looks at four problems in Japanese history, and those four problems have both written evidence and they also have archaeological evidence. So if you like Japanese archaeology, Sacred Texts and Buried Treasures is a book to go to. And it looks at, it goes back as far as 250 CE, goes back to a so-called empress of Japan who was called Himiko. And then it also talks about Japan's capitals and there's been a lot of digging on Japan's capitals. The other thing that's really interesting is that the Japanese have is that you can learn a lot about the relationship between Korea and Japan by archaeology. And there's a big controversy about whether Japan dominated Southern Korea uh, during its early history. And Japan and Korea were not on very friendly terms from 600 until 900. Never on completely friendly terms, and the Japanese considered them sort of inferior in many ways. And then the book also talks about this incredible archaeological source that's been uncovered. They're wooden tablets, and on the wooden tablets there's writing, and the writing gives us sources that we never would have had otherwise.
Hmm.
So sacred texts and buried treasures is exactly as the title said. Sacred texts is a written evidence. Buried treasures is the archaeological evidence, and it's all about the two different kinds of evidence and how you can match them up or not match them up, and what you can learn about Japan in 4 different areas.
Another book that we you guys might want to check out if you're into this subject is A Bull for a Coin, right? And I have heard about the medicinal purposes of Japanese tea. Seems like you did a little bit of research on that for this book. And there's something you talk about where it says Farris maintains that the increasing sophistication of Japanese agriculture after 1350 is exemplified by tea farming, which became so advanced that the Meiji entrepreneurs were able to export significant amounts of Japanese tea to Euro-American markets. So, can you tell us a little bit about this book? Yeah, not many of my guests have more than 2 books, so this is great that you have a wide variety.
Okay, well, A Bowl for a Coin is really the story of tea in Japan. And it purports to describe the history of tea in Japan from its origins around 750 all the way up until the present. And one thing that you might find really interesting is, for those of your listeners who are interested in modern Japanese history, is that tea was the second most important export of the Meiji government after 1850. The Japanese exported a huge amount of tea to other countries, and that's how they made their capital. And then they took that capital and used it and invested in industry and developed industry from that. Silk was a leading export, but then tea was second. And one of the major customers for Japanese tea was America.
Mm. How did it become so big? Is it simply because they have certain plants over there that we just don't? I mean, that's fascinating to me that that became export number 2. Silk, I understand, but tea?
Uh, tea, as I say, tea is an invasive species in Japan. It invaded Japan sometime around 750, and for a long time, it was just a minor drink, and it was only drunk by the elite. And so the people who would drink it would be aristocrats or samurai, but not the common people. But beginning around 1300, around this time that I mentioned, that's such a big change in Japanese history, tea began to be sold on the streets and by peddlers. And there were a number of improvements in the farming of tea that took place. And it became more and more widespread until you get to the Tokugawa period, which is after 1600. And tea has grown very widely in Japan. And the country really goes crazy for the drinking of tea.
Hmm.
It's interesting because when Japan and China and Korea and Vietnam were drinking tea, and when the Arabs were drinking coffee, the Europeans had no drink. They drank water. They either drank wine or they drank water. And tea is imported to Europe, uh, and coffee is imported to Europe. They all come from outside of that, and then the Europeans eventually established markets so that they could trade something for coffee or tea.
Hmm.
The first tea to go to Europe went to Europe around 1600, but not very much of it. You really don't get a big export trade in Japanese tea until after 1850. And then, as I say, it's interesting because one of the major customers was America, and they were drinking green tea. There are barns here where I live in Illinois that have advertisements on them for Japanese green tea.
Wow. Came across the oceans and people were advertising for Japanese tea on barns back in what year? Probably what year is that?
Uh, all the time from 1870 until about 1930. Once the Japanese military took over, Americans began to boycott Japanese tea and never really came back.
Mm.
But now it's more important again, and now you're getting companies like Itoen in Hawaii, that where if you go to Hawaii, you can buy green tea in big packages and drink green tea, and it's quite delicious.
One last book I want to bring up, and I think the cover is is wild. Japan's medieval population, famine, fertility, and warfare in a transformative age. Choice outstanding academic books, I guess, is the publisher. But this book right here, tell us a little bit about this and the cover that you chose. This is cool, guys. Look it up. Why did you make that the cover?
Uh, it's a cover because the book is one of the main themes of the book is about famine. And on the cover, what you see are the Japanese were so afraid of famine. This would have been all during the period. There were bad famines in Japan even in the 1830s. And eventually, in the I believe it was sometime around 1150 or 1200, they made a scroll called the Hungry Ghost Scroll. And what you see on the cover of that book are pictures of hungry ghosts. And if you notice, their stomachs are large and they look really gruesome.
Yeah.
And these are ghosts of people who have starved to death from famine.
Oh, yeah, it's creepy, man. It catches your attention for sure. So, was that their biggest fear, basically, starving to death?
Well, for a while it was disease, but eventually the Japanese overcame their fear of disease and the epidemics died down. But when the epidemics died down, the population grew, but they didn't have enough food to feed the people. And so there were terrible famine. There was a terrible famine in 1230. There was another terrible famine in 1260. There was another terrible famine in 1450 or 1460, and terrible famine in 1780s and 90s. And famine, if you notice, it's been recent. If you look at Shohei Ohtani, I mean, he's a big fella. Shohei Ohtani's a big fella, and he has to be able to hit all those home runs and do both pitch and to also hit home runs. But prior to that, during the Meiji period, prior to 1900, the Japanese were smaller, and their body weight was less and their height was shorter. And that's all because uh, food was relatively scarce.
Got it. And last question I have for you, whenever it comes to the origin of your love for Japan, I know you said you've lived there for over 6 years total. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a defining moment or something that you read or you saw or you have an experience with an individual that really made you curious about this culture and this part of the world? Um, Anything that stands out whenever you were a kid?
When I was a child, I wasn't interested in Japan. I wasn't interested in Japan until I went to undergraduate school. I went to undergraduate school at DePaul University in Indiana. And there are several things that stimulated my interest in Japan. One was I had a really excellent professor. His name was Clifton Phillips, and he got me really interested in Japan. And then the second thing was we had Japanese language at DePaul, and I took Japanese language, and it was my first spoken language. So I learned to speak Japanese while I was in Indiana. And then the third thing was in December of 1971, when I was still only 20 years old, I went to Japan for a year and 2 months, and I studied at Sophia University in Japan. And there, I just really fell in love with the culture. I had a Japanese girlfriend, had lots of things going on, and it was a completely transformative experience.
If there's one aspect of the Japanese culture that you would love for the Western culture to adopt, what is it?
Respect for the other person.
Yeah, you don't see that too much anymore around here.
No, no, no.
And respect for your elders. And what I realized is Japanese culture, they respect their elders. It's almost like that was the individual who ran the family, right? And I don't know if you see that as much anymore.
Yeah, you do have more respect for the elders, and you have a very good system of social support in Japan for elderly people. And of course, the Japanese population is growing old very rapidly, and the population of Japan is beginning to shrink
Jeez.
because you got so many old people, and young people are not interested in having children anymore, and so the population of Japan is shrinking. Same thing's happening with Korea. Same thing's happening with China.
And here, people are not having kids as much. Yep, it's happening.
The population of the United States is not shrinking, but it's about stable. Basically, the reason our population increases is because we have immigrants.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So without the immigrants, we would be shrinking.
That's right.
Man, great conversation. Guys, I recommend if you're into understanding a little bit more about Japanese history, he obviously knows his stuff. William Farris, he has 7 books on the topic. They're all on Japanese history, right?
They're all on Japanese history. That's right.
Yep. And the book that we specifically focused on was Japan to 1600, a social and economic history. I think your most popular is probably, let me see here. I think the one that has the most, A Bull for a Coin seems like the most popular one. So
Now the T book really hit a nerve.
yeah, people love that. It's over 60 reviews. They're tough to get. So great work, man. To get a hold of you, is there a channel, a website, or anything that you
I,
recommend for people to look up?
I have no website. The best way to get a hold of me is through my email.
Okay.
Is it okay to give my email address here or?
Yeah, please list it out. Most people who listen to this or who actually receive our podcast do it via audio through Spotify. So please do that. Yeah.
Okay. One way you can look me up is to go to. I was a professor at the University of Hawaii for 12 years, and so if you go to the University of Hawaii and then look up retired faculty, I'll be on that list, and my email address will be there. But for just to give you my email address, it is wfarris FARRIS at hawaii.edu.
Excellent. So if you are putting on a seminar, event, or a podcast that your audience would love to learn more about Japanese culture, he's your guy. So I really appreciate your time. And, this is one subject I don't know much about, but I'm curious about it. So thanks for opening my eyes to some things today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to advertise my writings, and maybe it will increase the interest in the books. I hope so.
In school, we don't know much about Japanese culture, right? Because of World War II history, we learn a little bit there, but we study extensively as kids in Egyptian culture, right? And some other cultures, but not so much Japanese. And I think that
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to have somebody give us a little bit of a background. So really appreciate your time. And remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.